Hi, everybody. Jeff Urbin here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Welcome to another one of our Facebook Live presentations. On behalf of our director, Paul Sparrow, and the entire staff here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, I want to welcome you to today's discussion. And today we're going to be talking about a little-known person in the Roosevelt legacy, FDR's father. Now, this month being June, it was Father's Day, and, you know, I happen to have had a great Father's Day. I think my kids got me the best stuff at the dollar store, and it always, you know, surprises me that there are so many things written about all of these Roosevelts, but a lot of people don't understand or don't know a lot about James Roosevelt. So today we're going to switch that. Now, we know about Franklin Roosevelt. Four-term president of the United States, creator of the New Deal, commander-in-chief during the Second World War, governor of New York State, assistant secretary of the Navy, New York State senator, polio victim, creator of the United Nations, creator of the March of Dimes, nothing to fear but fear itself, four freedoms, blah, 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 right? Everybody knows about that guy. And everybody knows about Eleanor Roosevelt, right? First Lady of the World, the My Day column, the whole Marian Anderson, the DAR resignation, the frumpy dresses, the civil rights, human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, blah, 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 right? Everybody knows about her. Everybody knows about Roosevelt, right? Franklin's mother, right? A kind of a, always at odds with Eleanor, domineering, you know, kind of a proud Delano, a little bit cranky, you know, but, you know, blah, 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 right? We know about her. And it was amazing to me how much has even been written about Fala, not the father, the Fala, right? Everybody knows he was FDR's dog, a Scottish Terrier, rumored to have been left on an island and had to have an aircraft carrier or a battleship or something like that sent back, and he barked longingly at FDR's funeral. People know a lot about that. But what do you know about James Roosevelt? Well, you probably know he was married to Sara Roosevelt, right? His wife. And you probably know that he was FDR's father. You probably also know that he died kind of early on. And so he has really kind of been left out of a lot of the Roosevelt story. But in fact, much of his influence can be seen in Franklin Roosevelt even throughout Franklin Roosevelt's life. So even though he spent only 18 years with Franklin Roosevelt, Franklin was 18 when his father passed away, the life lessons, the skills, the empathy, you know, and the values that his father instilled in him lived on long after James actually being on site. So today we spotlight James Roosevelt, FDR's dad. Now, FDR's dad, of course, traces his lineage all the way back to the 1640s when the first Roosevelts came to the New World. And they came up the Hudson River and they settled in what is now Esopus. Eventually, they would break off into two branches of the family. There would be one branch that stayed here in the Hudson Valley, and then there'd be another branch that went down and settled in the Oyster Bay area of the state. The Oyster Bay folks were the Teddy Roosevelts, and the Hudson Valley Roosevelts were the Franklin Roosevelts. So that's where these two branches have come off. And James's father, James Roosevelt, FDR's father, was born on July 16th in 1828 at the family homestead at Mount Hope, just on the northern edge of Poughkeepsie, New York. And his grandfather, also named James, had settled there and built a lovely country estate. And they split their time between the estate up here in the Hudson Valley, a brownstone in New York, and traveling around the world, right? So it must be nice if you can do that. Now, James, FDR's dad, was the son of Dr. Isaac Roosevelt, who attended Princeton and Columbia Medical School. But he was a doctor, but he couldn't stand the sight of blood, and he didn't have the heart to listen to people suffering about what was wrong with them. He was also a bit of a hypochondriac and would, you know, often, you know, imagine that he was getting the diseases and things that he was treating people for. So he did what I probably would have done. He quit and he stopped being a doctor, and he came back up here to the Mount Hope property. And he lived there and just grew plants until he was 37 years old. Then he decided to marry the girl next door, who was just 18 years old. And, she was another one of these, Hudson Valley, fancy families. And they got married, and James Roosevelt was born on July 16th in 1828. Now, he was being raised in a family run by Dr. Isaac was no easy task. James was tutored at home, just as FDR would later be, and he stayed there till he was in his early teens or so. Now, he was later sent off to private schools, first in Poughkeepsie and then in Lee, Massachusetts. And his parents adored him. Right. And he was tended to by a host of servants, and he roamed the family lands here, and he learned how to fish and hunt and sail and ride horses and all the things that that Franklin Roosevelt is going to learn how to do later on as well. But Dr. Isaac's fears, his phobias, his anxieties was a constant sort of pallor hanging over the family. He became obsessed that life could end at any moment, and that you better be ready to answer to God when that happens. So he was always running around, oh, the end is near. Are you ready? Or you better make sure you make right. And this is kind of an odd, sort of environment to grow up in. As a young boy. Now, when James was 9, FDR's dad was 9, he was sent off to the Poughkeepsie Collegiate School, just south of Mount Hope in Poughkeepsie. And there he began to study the curriculum of the sort of the landed wealthy here in the Hudson Valley. He studied French and Spanish and Greek and Latin and rhetoric and logic and math and history, and also some natural philosophy. All the sorts of things that you needed to be in this sort of wealthy, upper-class, well-educated group of folks. But the school in Poughkeepsie was a boarding school, and Dr. Isaac had problems with James going there. So he made sure that James was enrolled, but he wouldn't let him stay there overnight. So each day, James would be dropped off at the school, and each afternoon he would be picked up and brought back home again. And this made him something of an oddball in and among the rest of the students, and sort of a standout among his peers. This is, again, very much like FDR later on, when FDR is supposed to go to Groton School at the age of 12, but his mother keeps him back until he's 14. So some of these experiences that James is having as a child, Franklin Roosevelt is going to have similar experiences. And it's because of these experiences that James had as a child that he's able to sort of help FDR through some of these things, because he's been there. He knows, right? He understands what he's been through. Now, the rules at the Poughkeepsie Collegiate School were sort of open and lax, and the students were encouraged to read on their own, to grow, and to express themselves even outside of their studies. And as James began to expand his horizons and get more open-minded and begin to challenge things that were going on in the world, and develop his own sense of independence, even as a young boy, 9, 10 years old, Dr. Isaac saw this as being unruly. Right? It's like, wait a minute, this little young upstart is starting to, express ideas and have ideas of his own, and he's not growing up the way I want him to. So at 13, James was sent off to Lee School in Massachusetts, where it was a much stricter and more pious atmosphere. There were daily prayers offered each morning. Sundays were held sacred and were used for rest, study of the Bible, and reflection. And still, Dr. Isaac worried about whether James was reading the wrong things and learning the wrong things. But he was able to sort of keep that at bay and let him finish out there. Now, when James was finished there and wanted to go to college, he wanted to go to the University of New York. But Dr. Isaac, once again, was afraid that James would be exposed to germs and be exposed to filth and be exposed to the wrong kind of people and the wrong sorts of ideas in New York. And when James protested this and said, "Dad, I really want to go here," the compromise was struck. And the compromise was that James was allowed to go to the University of New York, but again, he couldn't live on campus. He had to live in the brownstone, the family's brownstone, there in New York. Well, things started off okay with his studies. He was doing well. But when James skipped out on 2 final exams and word got back to Dr. Isaac, he insisted that he transfer out of the city. See, these influences are already happening with you, James. We got to get you out of there. And he sent him off to Union College up in the good Dutch city of Schenectady. And once again, he was going to be living off campus, not on campus. So you can imagine growing up with a dad like this. It's kind of a pain in the neck, really. Well, young James soon joined a fraternity, right, because he was dying to fit in with the rest of the kids. And come to find out, this frat would very often meet in a pub. In fact, not only very often, but every time. And Dr. Isaac got word of this and learned that the school actually tolerated scuffles between the Union boys and the local kids as sort of a way to, even things out. So you had this sort of rich, classy, kids going here, these sons of rich folks, and you had the more Schenectady locals. And the way to sort of balance that out was with some friendly rivalries, pie stealing, window breaking, and occasionally even some fisticuff scuffles, but it allowed these guys to work out sort of a balance in terms of what was going on with this. And of course, Dr. Isaac was not happy about this. This is not his idea of the way, a young man should be raised. When James graduated in 1847, he announced plans that he was going to go off and explore the continent, meaning, of course, Europe. And he was going to do this for about 1.5 years. That was his plan. And of course, Dr. Isaac wanted none of this, right? What are you talking about? You just finished school. You now need to find a job. And I absolutely forbid the trip. James's mother stepped in on his behalf and made the case to Dr. Isaac that if James were to be traveling in Europe, given their upbringing and given their beliefs, he would be traveling in the hands of God. And she was able to convince him that James would be at least as safe in the hands of God as he would staying there with Dr. Isaac. And he gave in under the condition that they would meet up at the end in England. And that's exactly what they did. So Dr. Isaac was a huge sort of meddlesome, controlling force in James's life. And James was constantly struggling to maintain peace with his father, but also create his own independence. He loved his father and didn't want to be, outwardly defiant, but he also wanted to live his life. Okay, he also wanted to live his life. So I neglected to show you this, but this is the guy we're talking about, by the way. This is FDR's father, James Roosevelt. Okay, and this is the guy. And so James goes off and he spends 18 months in Europe, enjoying adventure after adventure, at one point joining some revolutionaries in Italy, staying with them for about a month, but not seeing enough action. He decided to move on with the rest of the continent. And he visited France, he visited Spain, he visited Germany, he visited Italy, and he even visited the Holy Lands. And, you could probably guess whose idea that was, Dr. Isaac. When he returned, he entered Harvard, as FDR would do later on in his life. And he got a law degree and then got a job at a prominent law firm, the Sillimans law firm. And he got this through connections through the family and also through his time at Union College. And he worked in the Silliman law firm for 2 years. He didn't particularly like the law, and of course, later on, when FDR becomes a lawyer, he doesn't particularly like being a lawyer either. So he's looking for something else to do. He's like, all right, I can kind of do this, but I don't really like doing this. So one of the Silliman law firm's clients was the Consolidated Coal Company of Maryland. And James took an interest in the coal industry. So they made their money. He began to make some money, not from lawyering so much, but through his investments and through his interaction with the Consolidated Coal Company of Maryland. So this is not an actual piece of coal from James's interest there. This is actually just a piece I got for Christmas. But he loved business, right? He loved the idea of the risks involved in business, the challenges involved in business, and the fact that much of what occurred, would occur based upon your own, spit and spunk. If you push things, they would happen. If you laid back, they wouldn't happen. And this sort of, caught his attention and caught his imagination. And so he became more and more involved with the Consolidated Coal Company of Maryland, and in fact was elected onto the board of directors. While he was there, of course, one of the main industries that coal was driving at the time was, of course, railroads. And so James then began to invest in the railroad industry, and he became a general manager in the Cumberland and Pennsylvania Railroad Company. So although the Roosevelt family crest has got 3 roses on it in the middle, they didn't make their money with roses. James made his money, his portion of the fortune. Of course, he inherited some from his Roosevelt lineage, but he made his portion of the family fortune in coal and also in railroads. And if you look down here, I'm going to put a little challenge out to you. Here is the Roosevelt family motto down here. Okay, so qui plantavit curabit. And without looking that up, let me know if you know what that means. Okay, let me know if you can figure out what that means. And if you have to look it up, that's fine too. Right? We all have to learn somehow. So James did very well in business, and he was able to build on his portion of the family fortune. Now, he never did quite as well as some of his contemporaries, like the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers, or the Goulds or the Astors or those sorts of folks. But nonetheless, he was making his way in the world. Having established his little portion of the fortune, he decided that he would get married. And on April 27th, 1853, he married a distant cousin, just as Franklin would, named Rebecca Bryan Howland. Now, this idea of marrying cousins and this sort of thing isn't as creepy as it might sound. One of the reasons that these families tended to marry distant members of the family or they would marry other well-to-do families was because in order to do that, or once you did that, you could assure that the person you were marrying wasn't marrying you for money, and they weren't marrying you for name recognition, and they weren't marrying you for your connections, right? Because they already had all that stuff. So you see these families kind of, intermarrying back and forth here and there, and it's really, it's okay. They're extended. There's a lot of them, and they're doing it in order to sort of preserve their own ability to know that they're not being taken advantage of. Well, they set up a homestead at Mount Hope, and they began a tradition of family trips to Europe, which is something that continued on in the Roosevelt family. And while in London, James was asked by the American minister there, none other than James Buchanan, yep, the one, if he would stay around and help out until a replacement could be found. So James was really pretty well connected in a lot of the political circles, in a lot of the business circles, and a lot of the financial circles of the time. They returned to the United States on March 27th. in 1854 and was born shortly thereafter a son. And it was Roosevelt tradition to switch back and forth the names every other generation between the names James and Isaac. And when James had his son, rather than name him Isaac, which should have been the next rotation, he decided to name him after himself. So I suspect what he was trying to do there was to sort of put a little distance between his sort of neurotic dad and sort of break that connection there a little bit, from passing it on to his son. And so his son was named James Roosevelt, but everybody called him Rosie. So this Rosie is actually Franklin Roosevelt's half brother. And he's about 27 years old, older than FDR, who will come much later. Now, Rosie was a very cheerful, happy-go-lucky youngster at first. And of course, he became the center of life at Mount Hope. And, just as James had been, and just as Franklin will become at Springwood a little bit later on, he was tutored at home, and he spent a lot of time with his parents. So when his father was out traveling on his railroads to do business and things around the country, little Rosie would go as well. When the Civil War came along, James was 32 years old, so he was a little bit old to enlist. And so he didn't join up, and he also was not called up. Now, later on, Franklin Roosevelt would make several claims that James's contribution during the Civil War was working with what was called the Sanitary Commission, which was established in 1861 to help tend to the sick and the wounded soldiers from the war. But there appears to be very little evidence that this actually occurred. So this might just be one of these sort of stories that, Franklin Roosevelt always believed you should never let the facts get in the way of a good story. And so this may very well be one of those. However, it is very likely that James did have an impact and an influence in the Civil War for the North, of course, through his railroads, through his railroad connections and such, sending machinery and materials and troops and such up to the front, as it were. In 1867, the end came for Dr. Isaac, as he had expected it would at any time, and he was 73 years old. And his fortune went to James along with Mount Hope. Now, as Rosie was growing older, he began to show some tendencies of his grandfather, a little bit of neuroses, a little bit of fear and anxiety and such, skittishness. He was troubled by bad dreams, and he developed a fear of water. Not water like tap water, but, lakes, ponds, streams, oceans, rivers, that sort of thing. This was not a good thing for Roosevelt, right? Because the Roosevelts and later the Delanos were sea-bearing people. So if you've got a fear of water, that's a big thing. Okay, that's a big thing. So what ends up happening is, in order to help young Rosie break through this, James enrolls him in swimming lessons, and he makes Rosie pay for the swimming lessons from his own allowance. So what James is doing here is he's addressing head-on these neuroses like he saw in his dad. They were never quite addressed. And he said, all right, first sign of this, we're nipping this in the bud. And not only that, I'm going to have you pay for it. And that will give you some skin in the game. That will give you an investment in your own future, an investment in your own getting better. And it will make you more determined to succeed. And in fact, it did. James, this is very typical of James. He was a devoted father. He was a devoted husband, a real family man. He loved animals, and he also loved the great outdoors. He was also a very kind and generous man. There's a story of one time when they were traveling in Europe. There was a little village that had a merry-go-round in the middle of it, and none of the village kids could afford the tickets for the merry-go-round. So James stepped in, and he bought every kid in the village a ticket for the merry-go-round, and they were able to ride for a half an hour on the tickets bought through James. So that's the kind of guy that he was. But he was also willing to bend rules and break rules that he thought were particularly silly. He loved to fish. One time he was in Spain and he was fishing, and a farmer came along and told him to get out of the stream and get off of his property. And James said, I'm fishing. It's a stream. It's, it's nature. I'm enjoying nature. And the farmer actually had him arrested. And so the police came, they took him off the property and said, listen, this is just a cranky old farmer. We're going to let you go. We're not going to press charges or anything, but just, you can't be in here fishing. And James thought that was ridiculous. And so he just went down the stream a little bit and went right back to fishing. No one can own, a natural resource like that. On one trip to Europe, word arrived that the beloved family home at Mount Hope had been burned to the ground, along with pretty much everything in it. And nobody quite knows how the fire started. Officially, it was listed as a faulty flue in one of the rooms. But James always had these suspicions that it was not a faulty flue, but he believed that the butler had started a fire. He had a suspicion that the butler was stealing from them, selling things off, when they weren't around, and that perhaps the fire was set to sort of cover his tracks. One of James's most prized possessions, his humidor containing 400 cigars, was also lost in the fire. And you can see here, he was a cigar connoisseur. He certainly liked to have a cigar several times a day. So they stayed in Europe for the rest of the winter. And James was able to keep up with the stock market and how things were going by having the New York Times sent to him no matter where he was. He generally tended to dislike city life. And he once said, I don't know how men can, live confined within these walls when the country is out there, calling to you with so much rest and so much relaxation and so much to offer. So he saw city life as really something that was more of a necessity to conduct business, right? You had to go into the cities to conduct your business and such, but then every chance he would get, he would, get back out into the country. And he especially liked the English countryside and the lifestyle and the pace of life that he found there. When they returned to the United States with Mount Hope, gone, James needed a new place to settle. So he was looking here in the Hudson Valley. He was looking, he had his eye on a piece of property that was for sale by the Astors up in Rhinebeck, New York. The price tag was $50,000. James offered $40,000. Mr. Astor would not come off his price. And so James was not able to get the property. But he did buy a farm south of there in Hyde Park, which was just north of the land that they had at Mount Hope. So they sold the property at Mount Hope to New York State, who then built a psychiatric center there. And James moved up the road 3 or 4 miles and bought a piece of property along the river. It was the old Wheeler farm. And Mr. Wheeler was actually a railroad executive who had sort of bought the farm just for the fun of it and decided that he didn't have really any hand in farming. And so the farm had fallen into a state of disrepair. And James saw this as an opportunity to rebuild, an opportunity to, put his stamp on this farm. Unlike inheriting the properties in the past, now he could buy this and kind of make it his own. And that's exactly what he did. So he bought this, and then within a year, he had most of the buildings back in a state of repair, the home back in a state of repair. And while he was on this property, he raised trotters, he grew crops, and he also raised Guernsey cows. One trotter that he raised was a trotter named Gloucester, and Gloucester actually broke a trotting record and was quite famous. And the governor of California offered to buy Gloucester, and James sold him Gloucester. And they put Gloucester on a train, and they sent him off to the West Coast. I think he was sold for $15,000. And unfortunately, on the way out there was a train wreck, and Gloucester was killed. So this was kind of a a shocking thing. I mean, here's your prize horsey that you're selling, to the governor of California, and you're all proud of this. You've made this great deal, and then the poor horse ends up, dying before he even is actually able to get there. James, in the political realm, becomes a Democrat after the Whig Party kind of dissipates and begins to fall apart. He believed that the Republicans were getting a little too radical, so he went with the Democrats. One of those particular radical folks that he pointed to was a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln, right, who had some pretty radical ideas for the time. And James's big issues were civil service reform, taming Tammany Hall, and also keeping government small. So keeping, small local government, not big, intrusive government, which is ironic because Franklin, of course, comes along and creates the New Deal program. Now, things were going along very well at the Wheeler farm, which incidentally James renamed Springwood because he thought that had a nice English, country home sort of name to it. It was about 110 acres, and things were going well there. The fields were coming along. The buildings were back in repair. The trotters were doing well. The cows were doing well, and they had this wonderful little life there until Rebecca begins to have heart problems, and she really begins to slow down, and James becomes devoted to taking care of her. Now, one of the things that he likes to do for her, first he has elevators installed in the brownstone in New York and up here at Springwood, so she doesn't have to go up and down the stairs. And one of the things he likes to do is he believes that the sea air is good for you. If you can just get out to the sea air, that'll bolster you back up. So he takes her on these on his yacht out on these sailing expeditions. And one day while he's out on the Long Island Sound, Rebecca has a massive heart attack. James puts in at port and lifts her off, carries her back to the brownstone, and she died there on August 21st, 1876. James was heartbroken. Absolutely heartbroken. So now here he is. He's about 57 years old, 58 years old. He's a widower. Rosie has begun to start his own life, and he's all alone. So he spends about 4 years as a lonely widower, dabbling in his business, but his heart really isn't quite in it anymore. And he begins to take a romantic interest in a distant cousin by the name of Bammy Roosevelt. Now, Bammy is Teddy Roosevelt's older sister. And Bammy really likes James. She thinks he's a great guy. He's smart, he's charming, he's sophisticated, a real gentleman, but she's just not interested in him that way. And he asks her to marry him, and she has to refuse him. And she feels so bad that she then takes it on as kind of a personal quest to find him somebody else. And so she decides that she's going to introduce him to a very good friend of hers, none other than Sara Delano. And Sara Delano is 27 years younger than James, and Bammy arranges for them to meet at this dinner party. And the accounts are that James walks in, he sees Sara, and it's love at first sight. And he spends the rest of the evening with her, the rest of the night, so totally focused on her. And she feels quite a bit of affection toward him as well. It wasn't quite love at first sight, but they were married within 6 months. So it took her a little longer to fall in love, but not a whole lot of time. So they get married on October 7th in 1880. And off they go to Europe, of course. This is the Roosevelt tradition. And then within a year or so of the marriage, on January 30th, 1882, Franklin Roosevelt is born. Now, I say within a year or so. I'm talking about the return from the honeymoon. There's no scandal here. And it was a very difficult birth. In fact, Sara and baby Franklin nearly didn't make it. It was a very difficult birth, over 24 hours of labor. Franklin was 10 pounds when he was born. And in fact, the doctor had to literally, breathe life into him when he was first born. He wasn't breathing very well. And so James considers the fact that he's got this new bride He's got this new son. They've had this difficult birth, and yet both of them have survived. So he begins to regard Franklin as something of a miracle baby. And he quite proudly puts out the birth announcement from Hyde Park, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on January 30th, 1882. And right down here, I love this. He puts down here on the little bundle, FDR. So we know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as everybody knows him, FDR, was known as FDR right from birth, and it's James who gives him that little nickname. So I always love that. You know, when you see the campaign buttons, you know, years and years later, you know, FDR, it always warms me to know that his dad was the one who kind of gave him the initials as the FDR. So that's kind of cool. James devotes himself to Sara and to Franklin. He was a devoted and very active father, and James and FDR were constant companions. So this is the kind of dad that James was. You know, he also had the same relationship with Rosie when Rosie was growing up. You know, he took fatherhood very seriously and was an active role model and an active playmate with both of his boys. And he teaches FDR how to shoot. He gives them a gun and he says, listen, you know, here's a gun you can use to shoot. And he encourages Franklin to shoot birds because Franklin is interested in birds. And that's how you study them back in the day. You know, we don't do it like that now. But James had very strict rules. Okay, you can use this gun to hunt birds for, you know, your scientific investigation, for your interest in them. But you can only shoot one bird of each kind, and you can't do it during nesting season. So he lays down some very strict rules for what FDR is going to be able to do. There's also a story of they were out riding around on the property, which they would do every morning. James would go out and, you know, explore the property, you know, talk to the workers that he had working there, you know, the folks working the farm, the folks working the fences, fixing the fences, the folks, you know, building the buildings, repairing the buildings and such. And they all referred to him as Mr. James, you know, which was both formal, you know, with the Mr. part, but also, you know, somewhat informal by calling him by his first name. And Mr. James was always James, never Jimmy, never Jim, but always James Roosevelt. So the folks on the property called them Mr. James, and he was always very involved in what they were doing and what they had going on in their own personal lives. He would ask about their children, their families. And then again, FDR is seeing this, and it instills in him this sense of caring for other people, or of taking an interest in other people, taking an interest in what other folks have going on in their lives. And there's a story about one time Franklin is out with his father, and he's on his little pony, and Franklin is kind of riding his horse sort of rough and being rough with the pony. And James tells him to get off the pony and take the pony back to the stable, you know, wipe him down, give him his meal, and I'll talk with you when I get back. And so, you know, again, this idea of, you know, responsibility, right? You know, you have this horse. This horse is a piece of your property, yes, but it's a living entity, and it needs to be taken care of, and you need to be respectful of it. And you know, now you have lost the right to ride this horse. You need to walk him back to the stable because you've been being so mean to him. And again, this instills this sense of responsibility and care in FDR. FDR called his dad Popsy. Right, so they were very close and very cute, you know, growing up. So let's take a look at what. Here's a picture. This is a picture of James and little Franklin, and I love this picture because, first of all, I think Franklin is like the cutest baby going. Right, I mean, I haven't seen a baby picture that cute since, well, like probably Easter when I was at my mom's house looking at baby pictures of me. So here's little baby Franklin, and there is his father. And I think you can just look and see the expression on their faces. You know, Franklin is just, you know, he's up there on his dad's shoulder. He's holding a rose, you know, the famous rose of the Roosevelts. He's got his hand over his dad's head, and he just looks peaceful. He just looks like a happy baby. You know, he's not fussy. It's not like they had to, you know, give him a cupcake or something to get up there. And you can see how proud James is, you know, holding up his son, you know, holding up, you know, this little baby that, you know, that he considers to be a miracle baby. By the way, that ring that's on there is a pinky ring, and that will go to FDR later on, and FDR will wear that ring from his father. So there is a picture of them when they're first getting started off, and then here is a picture of Franklin and James when Franklin is about 12. And again, you can see like now here Franklin is very intense, right? He's looking into the camera. And James, of course, is very staid, very stoic, very, majestic and gentlemanly. And these guys are good little buds here. When James, in 1891, James suffers the first of a series of heart attacks. And these heart attacks are actually quite debilitating to him. And so it's at that point that Franklin and James stop being kind of, these best little playmates, and Franklin then has to sort of take over a caregiver role to his dad. And it's at this point that because they're being less rough and tumble, they're able to spend more time talking with each other, sitting and chatting and, passing on Roosevelt stories and such. And Franklin, here's a picture of him and his mother, always took very, very great care to make sure that he was a good boy and that he did what he was supposed to do and not upset his father. He was, again, having sort of this caretaker role with his dad, and he didn't want to do anything that was going to upset his dad or make his dad's life any more difficult than it actually was. Now, when Franklin was a freshman at Harvard, 1900, Franklin's dad, James, dies of a heart attack, probably brought on in part due to a lot of trouble that Teddy Roosevelt, his grandson, Rosie's son, was getting involved with. Teddy had been at Harvard at about the same time, actually at the same time that Franklin was. Teddy did very well the first semester, and then the second semester he decided that he was going to marry a New York City prostitute, which of course did not go over well in the Roosevelt family. So from the October heart attack until he actually passed in December, James, was said to say over and over again to his wife, Sarah, don't let Franklin become like Teddy. Please don't let Franklin become like Teddy. And of course, Franklin was not going to do that because he was very careful about not upsetting his dad. So again, James Roosevelt passes away of heart disease at the age of 72 on December 8th, 1900. So James Roosevelt was the son of a neurotic doctor whose neuroticism was acted somewhat as a reverse role model for James. He did not want to become like his father, and he did not want to be the kind of father that his father was. He was a lawyer. He was a businessman in coal and railroads and finance. He was a community servant. He served one term as the town supervisor in Hyde Park, and then never ran for office again. He didn't really like the rough and tumble world of politics. Of course, Franklin does, but James did not. But he went on to serve on the school board. He was on the board of the psychiatric hospital in Poughkeepsie. He was a country gentleman, a public servant, a caring husband, a lonely widower, a lover of animals, a lover of the great outdoors, smart and kind and generous and respectful. And, he really, he lived a life that was a great example for Franklin Roosevelt. So in short, James Roosevelt was just a really neat guy, and he instilled in young Franklin a sense of community and responsibility and the need for public service, a respect for those in your employment and, common people. And not everybody lives like us, Franklin. We have to respect that. We have to understand that. An appreciation for the values of money, but not to the point of obsession or lust for it. He instilled multiple interests and hobbies in Franklin, like fishing and reading and sailing and ice boating and riding and hunting and those sorts of things. The sense of importance of history and lineage, that we are all connected to something that came before us and are connected to the things that will follow after us. He instilled in Franklin this love of the land. You know, he allowed Franklin to travel and run around on the property just as he had as a boy. And then later on, you know, he takes Franklin to Europe each year, you know, and allows him to have these adventures there as well. He instills in Franklin a spirit of adventure and a spirit of fun. And most of all, a spirit of optimism, that things could always get better, right? That no matter how bad things were, things could always get better if you work and you apply yourself. See where you are, work from where you are to make things better. Whether it's your home burning to the ground and having to find a new family homestead, whether it is restarting your life at 57 or 58 because the love of your life has passed away. Whatever it is, see where you are and work from there to make things better. All of these traits passed on to a man who's known throughout the world, from a man who was often overlooked. So way to go, James Roosevelt. Now we'll open it up to some questions and answers. Let's see here. Some howdy-do's from some old friends here. Hey, everybody, how you doing? Good to see you all. 1931 book titled Franklin D. Roosevelt, A Career in Progressive Democracy by Ernest Lindsay says that James built a 6-hole golf course on the Springwood estate in 1890 after a trip to France. Sarah's diary mentions playing golf with James. Is the location of the course at Springwood known? You know, that's a great question. That's really a question for the Park Service, because they're the ones who actually administer the Roosevelt home. We administer the National Archives administers the Presidential Library. And I have heard tell of that golf course, but I'm not sure where on the property that would be. I do know that they had tennis courts, and those are still, well, they're not still there, but you can see where they were, and they had the fences and such. That I could tell you where that is, but I'm not sure where the golf course is. That's an interesting question, and I will definitely check in with our friends at the Park Service on that. Let's see here. How much was James worth when he died? That's an interesting question. The way it worked was this. Much of the Roosevelt fortune came from the Delano side. So James was worth, I think, something in the neighborhood of about $700,000 when he died, which would be about $6 million in today's money. And when he married Sarah, Sarah had inherited from her father $1.3 million in their time, which would be the equivalent to about $28 million in our time. So the bulk of the Roosevelt fortune really came from the Delanos, but he had built up a sizable fortune of his own, about $6 million in our day. When he passed away, which was not big money compared to like the neighbors up the street, the Vanderbilts. So the Roosevelts were kind of old money built slowly over time, and the other folks in the neighborhood were kind of big money built quite quickly. Okay, what else do we got here? Did the Delano family have a Massachusetts connection? Yes, the Delano family had a homestead over there in Massachusetts, and then they also had a homestead here in the Hudson Valley down just above Newburgh, and that was, when Sarah and James got married, they spent a lot of time down there in terms of like for family holidays and such. They would go down to the Newburgh estate, and the Massachusetts connection was over in Fairhaven, Mass. Someone else is telling me in here. Let's see. Would FDR's children enjoy the same type of relationship with their dad? Oh, great question. The answer to that is yes and no. Franklin was a real playmate, you know, a very actively involved father when the kids were little. And then, of course, he contracts polio, and that totally sidelines him and changes his direction. You know, and Anna writes, you know, in some of her writings about how difficult it was to see this, you know, this vibrant, strong, healthy guy who, you know, could outjump them and outrun them and all this. And then all of a sudden, you know, he was, you know, in their word, an invalid, you know, unable to, you know, to walk or stand on his own. So yeah, in the early days, he was very much, you know, a hands-on dad with the kids, at least in terms of the, you know, instilling of the love of the land and the love of the water and those sorts of things. When it came to discipline, Franklin, you know, tended to let other folks like Sarah, his mom, or Eleanor be kind of the bad guys in those sorts of things. Okie dokie. What else do we have? Okay. All righty. Yeah. So that looks like it's about it for the questions here. But I want to I just you know, want to thank you for letting me do this presentation today, because I really do feel that, you know, James is kind of the forgotten Roosevelt. And the more I learned about him, and it wasn't easy because much of his material isn't even digitized yet. It's still, you know, in the old paper form. But here's a guy who really had an impact and really had put an imprint on, you know, on young Franklin. They were only together for 18 years, but that influence, those skills, those values, those beliefs and ideals lived on in Franklin for the rest of his life. So, to my knowledge, the only memorial to James Roosevelt is the little library in Hyde Park, the James Memorial Library, which is part of the Mid-Hudson library system. Beautiful little library, wonderful little library that Sarah had built in his honor. But a lot of people don't know what a great guy James was. A very, very good role model for our 32nd president, helping him to prepare to get us through the Great Depression, through the Second World War, and through the creation of the United Nations. So something to think about here in this month of June in terms of Father's Day. So thank you for joining us. We will see you again sometime soon. In the meantime, visit us on the website. We've got plenty of information there. You can learn more about us and the Roosevelts there. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.